channel, show some more love to the Big Ten. And I thought in this video, go with the Maryland Terps. They've been under the radar for a number of seasons for the most part. I mean, this year they went 4-8, which is really disappointing compared to the 7 or 8 games that you've been used to in 2022 and 2023. And in many ways, Maryland is in a make or break season. Mike Locksley is going to his 7th season, overall record of 33-41. And, he has a lot of history with this school. He was the interim coach after Randy Enzall was fired. He had a brief stint at New Mexico back in 2008, 2009. So he has some extensive experiences as head coach. He's a phenomenal recruiter, and he's a player's type of coach, particularly doing a phenomenal job recruiting within the retro Washington, D.C. area, which is a market that they've really tried to tap into over a number of years, and you're finally starting to see some success there. As of right now, they are 31st in the country in terms of recruiting. And then even if you want to go down memory lane and look at some of the recruiting rankings that they've had then, before in 2024, they dipped to 54th. And then you go to 2023 and they were 33rd. And then in 2022, they were 38th. So, I mean, you definitely kind of sit there and say to yourself, hey, you've always kind of been in that top 30 echelon too in terms of recruiting. You're undefeated in bowl games. However, all those bowl game wins they've been against teams who've at least lost 5 games. So you have to kind of take that with a grain of salt. But also Maryland's a really tough place to win too. They haven't won a conference championship in this decade. And even when they were in the ACC, they were kind of just a middling program. And I guess this speaks for, Maryland fans in general, but the expectations there in many ways to me would be comparable to what the Iowa Hawkeyes have right now. If you can consistently win 8-9 games every year, with the floor being 10 games, and then your worst season is maybe a 5 or 6 win season, that's pretty solid for Maryland football, especially knowing that they've spent a lot of NIL money and resources, particularly playing basketball. And now the football program is starting to kind of find its way back. Obviously, going into this season, this is a really disappointing year, as I put in the quote with Mike Locksley. And I think many of the projections that you saw in the Big Ten media polls had somewhere, at least Maryland at the very least, being in a bowl game. But there are a number of different reasons why they had a lot of disappointing moments this year. I'd say first and foremost, they had a pretty tough schedule. I mean, you look at the schedule that they had last year, and they lost to Northwestern, which to me is probably a team that you're going to have to start beating on a regular basis if you want to get to that 8-9 win consistent team winning. And then you got Iowa that they lost to, and then Penn State and Oregon too. I mean, granted, they did knock off USC 29-28 in a really strong back and forth matchup, and their defense really carried them in that game. But you have to think to yourself too. You definitely missed Tua Jr., who was at Maryland for the most part when they had the most success that they've had under Mike Locksley. And now you're at the point where you bring in Malik Washington, a 4-star recruit who could definitely be in contention for the starting job this year. But at the same time, you have to sit there and say to yourself, what are they going to do in terms of kind of the long-term picture? Because in many ways, they are kind of stuck with Mike Locksley, but they're going to be at the point now where they're going to have to take that next step in order to kind of say to themselves, okay, this is the guy that we want to keep in the long term. Because at least last year, that last game to Penn State, I mean, that's got to be a pretty humiliating way to go out, losing 44-7. And they've had a bunch of seniors on this team too. So it definitely makes me question a little bit in terms of how quickly Maryland's going to get momentum going into 2025. They're going to have to play a lot of younger freshmen and sophomores who might not be ready right now. And especially in a really tough Big Ten conference, the one thing that they all have in common is the defensive line. Is a lot of these teams have some of the best defensive lines in the entire country. And if you ask me, that was Maryland's biggest struggle was particularly on the offensive line, where they were essentially turned into a one-dimensional team. And anytime they did try to pass the ball, they just got completely wrecked. So you sit there and say to yourself, okay, Maryland's going to do a lot right now in particular to really try to address the offensive line, because in my opinion, that's by far the biggest need that they have. They have a couple of decent playmakers who I think could make a presence there. But you sit there and you kind of wonder too, will this be enough to save Mike Locksley's job? Because in many ways, I think he is I think he is coaching for his job this year. And yes, he's been undefeated in bowl games. And yes, I think in a way that he's brought some stability to this Maryland program that they've been missing since Randy Inzall. And not to mention too, let's give him some credit for being able to face all that adversity that DJ Duncan kind of left him with, because at the time the board of directors recommended keeping him, but then due to the outrage of the fans or whatever, they decided that it was best to get rid of him. And it made all the sense in the world to bring on Mike Locksley as your coach. And especially he's described in multiple interviews that this is essentially his dream job. And especially when you're sandwiched in a conference like the Big Ten and you're always on the outside looking in, you got to have a guy who's passionate about the program, who cares about the program, and understands the sensitivities and the challenges that come with this type of job. And granted, you go back and you look at the time when they're in the ACC too, and in many ways, the challenges that they have in the ACC are also going to be present in the Big Ten, no matter what. It just doesn't help too that you have USC and UCLA that you have to deal with too, and now you have all those traveling logistics you have to worry about too. Because I also read a stat that they traveled some of the most in the entire country in terms of their divisional matchups too, because they did have to travel to USC, and not to mention too, when you have to play Nebraska every year too, it definitely adds on to that. But there are some silver linings and some positives that I think are worthy of pointing out. I'd say first and foremost, you have a much more generous schedule in 2025. When I look at their schedule, their toughest road game this year is going to be versus Illinois. And what's even better about their 2025 schedule is they end the year versus Michigan State, but they avoid Michigan, you avoid Penn State, you avoid any West Coast any games where you have to travel on the West Coast for. So in many ways, you're kind of sitting there, and you avoid Ohio State too. So looking at this full picture, you do have some optimism going in. They have brought in a couple 4-star guys, and they're brought in a blue chip recruit for the 2026 season, which is really strong to see. It is really great that they're being a lot more sensitive in terms of recruiting, with particularly in-state and in the DC area. But at the same time, you have to sit there and wonder, will these upcoming freshmen and these young sophomore kids, are they ready to be able to produce at an immediate level? Because there's really no way around it. This could be a much younger team than what we've seen in years past, and particularly at the quarterback position and also on the offensive line to some degree too. Yes, they're going to bring in some transfers to help kind of alleviate those immediate concerns, but at the same time too, it just kind of makes you wonder at the same time, because Maryland fans for the most part are used to 7, 8 wins every single season, and they did it in 22 and 23 when they had a competent quarterback and Tualua there. But at the same time, all things considered, they are moving in the right direction. Mike Locksley, I'm a huge fan of him, and I think he's one of those guys where you really do want to see him succeed.